Welcome back to the Daily Drum on WHUR and Sirius XM Channel 141. This is the Insight segment. I'm Harold Fisher. Tonight, living beyond the trauma. Yesterday, a lone gunman once again shattered the sanctity and safety of a community, killing 2 children and injuring 18 others after opening fire through the stained glass windows of Annunciation Catholic Church in Minneapolis, Minnesota during Mass. This devastating event has left communities across the country reeling with shock, pain, and anger, prompting many to ask a very troubling question. How can we begin to heal at home, at school, at work, even in church, and within ourselves after such a horrific incident? Well, my guest is Dr. Nicole Cutts, a licensed clinical psychologist and CEO of Cutts Consulting. She has some practical advice and tips on how to navigate this extremely difficult time. Dr. Cutts, thank you again for joining the program. I really appreciate your time.
You're welcome. It's good to be here, Harold.
Let's start with what actually happens to the brain and body when someone experiences a traumatic event like this, say a child all the way up to the 80-year-olds who were wounded during that morning mass yesterday. Does it matter the age? Does it matter those circumstances?
Yeah, the age definitely matters. Children are going to process things differently than adults, or maybe even as our, older citizens would. So yes, age does matter. But the effects are very negative on any age group. You had talked about what are the effects of trauma on our brain. There are many effects, and it depends on if it's long term or if it's an incident like this. The most common effect we know about is PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and we can talk about the symptoms of that. But prior to PTSD, or your symptoms don't have to rise to that level, but you can still and will most likely experience post-traumatic stress, period, right? It doesn't have to be a disorder. It has a lot of the signs and symptoms of PTSD, but it's just not as protracted. But you're still going to experience that stress and the feelings that come with trauma.
When you talk about PTSD specifically, how do you know the difference between a normal stress response and what develops into PTSD?
A lot of it has to do with the longevity. So post-traumatic stress should dissipate as time goes on, and often with some help from a therapist and especially somebody who is an expert in trauma. That's very important. But PTSD is like the more complicated form, that it lasts longer, it's more disturbing or disruptive to your life. PTSD, like post-traumatic stress, is marked by flashbacks, hallucinations, other phobias or fears developing, being easily triggered, things like loud noises or even crowds, any situation that might bring the person back to the original trauma. So even if you don't have PTSD but have post-traumatic stress, you're still likely to have flashbacks, dreams, a feeling of derealization, depersonalization, where you will be unable to function in the way that you functioned prior to the trauma.
Let's talk a little bit about the children. Over the past 24 hours or so, there have been several interviews on network television, network news, of the children who survived this incident. And I'm really struck by 2 boys, one of them a young 5th grader, a white kid, and a biracial kid, also probably 5th grade. Both of them were matter of fact in their interviews. They were very expressive. They they just kind of told it like it is.
Mhm.
But the thing that really struck me was the the biracial kid was standing next to his mother, and her mother could barely keep it together, and the mother was, and he was comforting the mother.
Mhm.
And I don't know whether or not you can really address this. Different people react in different ways, and we
Mhm.
always hear that children are resilient.
Mhm.
Um, how do you explain the calm nature of these two boys, certainly not
Mhm.
knowing them, but the
Mhm.
way in which they were just matter of factly explaining what happened, and they just seemed so calm.
Well, there could be a few explanations for that. One of them being that at their young age, they don't fully understand the enormity. You know, when you're a child, you can't conceive of being an adult losing a child. Like for a lot of us, that's a part of what is so traumatizing is the thought for parents of losing children. They also don't have the breadth and scope of experience to understand what it means to have your life cut short at such a horribly young age. It could also be explained by what I think is a collective issue, which is, again, that sense of derealization and depersonalization. They might be somewhat inured to this because it happens all the time, you know,
Mm.
and even if they haven't witnessed it personally, they are hearing about it. They may, I don't know, they might have practiced for shooters. You know, this has become, unfortunately, again, a part of our day-to-day lives. And so children might be somewhat, I don't want to say callous, but just habituated to the situation. And it could also be that it's going to take time for them to even realize that this is a trauma. You know what I mean? Like things can happen when you're young that at the time you don't necessarily pay much attention to. Maybe their brains are protecting them somewhat. It can still show up later in terms of PTSD or post traumatic stress.
That's really interesting because, as kind of an aside, we do know
Mhm.
that there are adults who have issues with traumas that happen to them as children. Sometimes those things do not present until they are well into adulthood. Sometimes they don't
Mhm.
remember these things.
Mhm.
This could be applicable not only to the a school violence related incident.
Mhm.
It can manifest itself in a sexual assault, for example. It
Mhm.
could come about with any kind of child abuse, and then all of a sudden at 30
Mhm.
years old or 35 they begin to act out or
Mhm.
begin to in some way have issues with
Mhm.
something that for years was not problematic.
Mhm. Yes. Yes. And a part of the reason why that happens is because our brain has several ways of protecting us in the moment. And a part of that is to sort of separate yourself from what's happening, right? So it's not depersonalization, it's not derealization, and the word will come back to me. But it is where you separate a part of you from the what's actually going on. So it's kind of like you're observing it, but you're not feeling it, right? And that's a natural thing that we do oftentimes to, and not on purpose, that our brains do to protect us in the moment. It's similar to if you're in an accident and you experience, you know, a broken arm or foot, your adrenaline keeps you from feeling it right in that moment, right?
Mm.
But then later on, you feel that feeling.
When you talk about addressing trauma, being proactive,
Hmm.
so it's been 24 hours.
Hmm.
Those children who have survived this, who were not wounded, were able to get out. And we often hear that school officials will say that counselors are available for the children. And we hear that so much, but
Mhm,
rarely do we get an understanding of what happens once
mhm,
those counselors or therapists are injected into this
mhm,
situation. And so
mhm.
as a therapist, what would be your first action?
Well, Harold, I first have to say I am not an expert in trauma or crisis intervention.
Mm,
So honestly, whatever it is that I think is not necessarily applicable,
mhm.
because I would be practicing outside of my scope if I went into that situation. So what I'm imagining happens, and what my common sense tells me, is that they have a protocol. They have a protocol for dealing with incidents like this, um, and they probably get the children to feel safe in the moment. They might do some grounding exercises, which is something that we can all do at any time. To try to center themselves. It's also probably a lot of listening to the children, because it's important for them to unburden themselves, not for a therapist or a counselor to inject anything into them, right? So, one thing I'm almost 100% sure they would do, and what I would do, is to not tell them how they're feeling, right? Because when you do that, you can be injecting something into them or suggesting that this is the way that you should feel. So I'm sure there's a lot of listening that's going on, and not leading the children. And then it can't, but it also can't just be one time, right? So counselors are available. They come in. There is a response for right after something happens, but then you also need to look at what are they doing long term, right? It might not be enough to just say counselors are available, right? They should probably have some sort of follow up after that initial encounter with the school, so that there's a plan that's worked out, and it doesn't leave it to the parents or the children to say, I need to go talk to somebody, because that might be difficult for them.
What is a grounding exercise?
So, a grounding exercise is a somatic technique. I use somatic techniques in my therapy and coaching practices. And it has to do with putting the focus on your body to increase your emotional intelligence. And when I talk about emotional intelligence, I'm talking about their four competency areas. The first is self awareness, the second is self management, the third is awareness of others, and then the fourth is relationship management. So a grounding exercise comes in the first two, awareness of self and self management. Okay. So first you have to tune in all somatic exercises. The name somatic comes from the Greek word soma, meaning body. So you have to tune in to what's going on in your body. You talked initially about what happens in your brain when you experience a trauma. Well, there's always going to be an escalation of adrenaline. Your autonomic nervous system is going to jump in to gear, and that's when you have the fight, flight, or freeze syndrome.
Hmm.
Okay, again, another self-protective mechanism that we were born with. But the problem, and this is also implicated in PTSD and post-traumatic stress, is that your body does not know when to shut it off. Okay, so when you are experiencing that fight or flight, you're not grounded, right? It's your adrenaline is pumping, the ability to think clearly is dampened, your heart rate might be increased, blood pressure, all of that, right? So in the grounding practice, and there are several, which again is a somatic practice, so it's putting the focus on your body in order to change how you feel. It would have to do with experiencing yourself just in the moment. I do one grounding practice where you're standing and you experience the different dimensions of your body, and they're associated with different dynamics in the world. But so a grounding exercise, I think I've gone pretty far, not afield, but just gone deeply into the explanation. A grounding exercise is just that. It's like bringing you back to ground. So it could be something like just feeling your feet where they are on the ground, inhaling, exhaling, feeling yourself in a chair, wherever you are, but it has to do with, it's also becoming more mindful. It's a mindfulness exercise also, but in terms of you're being fully embodied in that moment and you're experiencing the grounding, which will help to take you out of what's going on up here, because when the fight or flight is triggered, your brain starts not being able to think clearly, going all over the place, and that response also keeps the pedal on the gas of the stress response. So if you can break that by bringing your body back down, shoulders back down, as if you were calm and not under threat, it can send a signal to your brain that everything is okay. And that's grounding.
Stay with us. We are going to take a very short break, but don't forget you can hear this and every edition of the Daily Drum Insight segment via podcast on WHUR.com. The original Quiet Storm with Raheem Devon is coming up next. That's on WHUR-FM. This conversation continues on Sirius XM, channel 141 and 96.3 HD2 in just a few seconds. Welcome back to the Daily Drum on Sirius XM, channel 141. I'm Harold Fisher. We continue our conversation about dealing with the trauma of yesterday's shooting in Minneapolis, Minnesota. My guest is Dr. Nicole Cutts, a licensed clinical psychologist and CEO of Cutts Consulting. One of the things that I think really strikes a lot of us, and I'm sure this was something that everybody was talking about yesterday. You didn't have to live in Minnesota to be impacted by this. And I spoke to my mother this morning, and she was talking about it because I have two cousins that work in public schools. My daughter is a teacher, and everyone is just really affected by this. And to be quite honest, I also thought about the Emmanuel AME 9 in Charleston, because they were also killed in a church where so many of us who are peoples of faith, no matter where you worship, you would think that churches, mosques, wherever, temples, wherever you are, that would be a safe space. Obviously, in the Charleston incident, they had invited, as some would say, invited the devil inside. But this happened from outside. And so how do people, gosh, this is such a difficult question. How do people assure themselves that you can be, safe in these really difficult times? And I'll go back to, to this specific, in a moment, but this really kind of shadows a feeling of safety and security.
Yeah. And there's no way to assure yourself that you can be safe, quite frankly. Anything can happen at any time. I'm, not meaning to be pessimistic or alarmist. I'm just a realist.
Yes, absolutely.
So it's not, I don't recommend telling yourself that you're safe. What I recommend is, especially for children, we'll start with children, is letting them know how safe they are, what is in place, right? And giving them that reassurance, right? But you also need to prepare them gently for life that horrible things do happen, right? But don't emphasize that, right? So you're not telling them, oh, you'll be okay, nothing will happen to you. That's not realistic. That's why they prepare kids. That's why they have these shooter drills, which I wish we didn't have to have. And I know this is not a conversation about sensible gun control, but I do frankly get tired of having this conversation, right? Like, what can we do now that this thing has happened? Well, whatever we do now is not going to bring back those children or the people in South Carolina or anybody else who's been the victim of gun violence. But as parents and as teachers, you can give kids as much security as is possible, is true, assure them of what does exist, and, prepare them that bad things do happen, right? You don't have to go into detail. I wouldn't suggest plunking your children in front of the TV to see any of this, and also to listen to them, right? To ask them how they feel. What could you do to help them feel safer, right? For adults, little less of a soft touch. You can't be safe. Yeah, we see that anything can happen anywhere. And again, not to be on a soapbox, but I'm going to go ahead and get up on it anyway. If you want to be safe, then you should probably put some energy toward doing something to make us all safer, right? Not just say, oh, this is a shame. But what, that's the other thing that you can do when you're experiencing any kind of trauma, or not when you're experiencing it, but afterward, is you can feel better by doing something about it. A big part of the problem when a traumatic event happens like this, or a plane crash or whatever, you're right, your sense of safety but also control is shaken, right? So it can be helpful to do something that gives you back that sense of control or that agency. So, anybody who's listening now, I would say absolutely, do grounding techniques. Try not to give in to the fear, but actually do something about this issue.
The young person who was the perpetrator of this crime, the reporting has been that all three of the firearms were legally purchased. And so I would imagine that, to your point about doing something, and this is outside of the therapy piece, but maybe this could be a form of coping, and you tell me. But if someone does something, if you perhaps are a responsible gun owner, maybe you do want to double check to make your firearms are secured.
Absolutely.
Yeah, if you have children or there are other people in your home, make sure you do that. Maybe, and I'm just kind of spitballing here, but
No,
maybe,
you're right on track.
yeah, talking to your neighbors who, under different circumstances, may not be receptive to these kinds of conversations. Responsible gun owners or not. But now, golly, what do you think about that thing that happened in Minnesota yesterday? Oh my goodness, it's horrible, horrible, horrible. And it, maybe you say, what I decided to do was, I just double checked to make sure that my gun safe was locked, or double check to make sure my gun lock was secure. Maybe double check to make sure, my children, revisit those rules that we've had, in the house ever since you owned the one handgun or several firearms legally. And maybe that could be not just making change within the community of your household, but also that could be one way to address coping strategies.
Absolutely. And that's a good reminder that doing something is not just about putting pressure on our elected officials. It's also, what can you do? And so practicing sensible gun ownership is one of the most important things you can do. And that does involve like making sure your guns are locked up and secure, out of reach of children or anyone else. Even how you handle your firearms. You cannot, just grab a gun and think you know what you're doing. It's a complex killing machine. So how you take care of that, how you teach your children gun safety is very important. And speaking to people, right? There's a campaign that the National Ad Campaign has launched, and it's called, I think it's called Number One. And it has to do with the fact that gun deaths are the number one cause of killers of children in the United States. Number one cause of death of children in the United States, which I think is a horrible horrible statistic. And yes, there are some things we can do personally to prevent that, as you mentioned. And no, I don't think it's separate from the conversation around psychology. It's actually embedded in it, because you're doing something, and that will give you more of a sense of safety.
Let me ask you this, and going back to yesterday's horrific incident, the police have released a significant amount of information
Mm-hmm.
about the perpetrator of this crime. And one of the things that has come out based on information that they released about the manifesto that was left behind was that this person had a lot of hate toward Jews, towards Black people, towards Catholics. And there are other pieces of information. His mother used to work there. And at one point, she, and when I say she, because she was identified as a transgender young woman. But let's just talk about the hate for a bit as it relates to having children move through this. Is that information helpful in informing children to say this person had an issue with everyone, and as a result, you need to understand can you talk about the power of loving your fellow man, your community, and realizing that, for those of us, and again, I'm not a psychologist, that's why you're here, but I'm just kind of thinking that even though I'm the parent of an adult, I'm
Mm-hmm.
just wondering, when my daughter was little, and if she had experienced this, how would I explain the nature of what some people would consider evil?
Mm. So is the question about explaining it to
Yeah,
them, or what we can
explaining.
do
Yeah,
about
how do you explain
it? Well,
that?
I wouldn't focus on explaining the nature of evil. I think it would be more important to teach your children to be more loving and tolerant and accepting of other people. And even with that, you can have people like this person, this murderer, who are quite frankly mentally ill, right?
Hmm.
Um, so yes, I do think that we can not just teach our children, but all of us can look at ourselves and say, how much hate do I contribute to the atmosphere of this country, of this world, of this planet, right? Because we're all swimming in this milieu of hatred and not, just all of the evils that we're seeing. Basically, I'm not going to list them all, but we're all steeped in that, right? And it's having a deleterious effect. I mean, the figures for mental health for young people in this country are also abominable, right? That doesn't just happen. That's not the individual children or their parents. That's the whole society. The whole society has this ill. And I'm going to go ahead and say that in some ways it's worse because it's being sanctioned, it's being displayed every day um, because of who's supposedly the leader, who's not a leader. So it's very difficult, right? How do you not have more hate meeting hate, right? So I would talk to my children and myself about that. Like, how much hate and violence do I put out in the world? Right.
Hmm.
We don't need any more of that. I'm shocked as I move around out here at the number of people who are, still being like such, selfish or piggish people on the road, or they're sniping at people. I'm like, do you not understand what's going on out here? Like, this is nothing. We don't need this. Right. But it's, I think people habituate to a situation and they think it's normal. It's like, no, this isn't normal. And we should all be contributing to the solution and not the problem.
Hmm. You know, when you when you think about just kind of I guess moving through, when you think about moving through this, this process, and again, talking about your own communities and doing something proactive, we have seen, and we haven't heard from the mother of the perpetrator of this crime yet. We don't know if we will, but we have seen, for example, in the mass school shooting in Michigan and others involving young people, that parents often say they did not know. And what would you say to parents with young children about paying attention to? I mean, to me, this is a no-brainer, but I think this is another one of those prime opportunities for parents to take another look at what their children may be into.
Yes, yes. And it's not just young children. It's all your children. To say that you didn't know. Now, I'm not in each person's home, so I'm not going to sit here and judge the mother or father. I notice we always talk about the mothers. So I'm not in their homes. I wouldn't presume what they are doing. But I do know that in a lot of these cases where somebody becomes a killer, a murderer, what have you, that there definitely were signs, right? And it's not always the parents who don't see them and address them. It's often the mental health system. It's often the police, who don't understand mental illness, and they don't address it properly. I mean, the figures on how many people, as women especially, who are stalked, abused, victims of domestic violence, who then end up becoming homicide victims, is ridiculous, right? And if you look at those cases, and very often they had sought help, so it is not just the parents, but the parents obviously play a crucial role. You should be paying attention to your kids and what's going on with them and how they're feeling. And if it seems that they are in crisis or they're likely to cause a crisis for somebody else, then absolutely you should not bury your head in the sand, but you should address it as best as you can. Because again, you might try to get help for them and are not able, right? So I think one of the things that, you and I need to do is, and you probably are going to do this already, but have resources that are attached to this show for people to have and know about. Where do you reach out for mental health information? Where do you reach out for crisis information? All of these things. Where do you reach out to learn what you can do to prevent gun violence and deaths?
And to that point about understanding whether or not a child or young person is in crisis, because again, children are certainly impressionable. And if you go in your child's room, and it's one thing if your son, for example, is doodling about what?
Murder, mayhem.
Yeah, but they could have been, watching a movie. They could have been watching Saving Private Ryan. They could be doing, video games, and they're just doodling about this. And the six is they're just doodling about a video games, or the half dozen is that they could be in crisis.
Well, what you're looking for is not a one-off incident. You're looking for a pattern. You're looking for other signs and symptoms, but more at this point, I would say signs. For example, we know that people who turn out to be psychopathic serial killers have a history of torturing animals when they're young, right? Having a fascination with death, those kinds of things, right? Having abnormal reactions to situations that other people, would not. So it's not just a one-off thing. If you go in your son or daughter's room and you find them doodling a bloody doodle, I wouldn't run out and call the authorities, but I would certainly talk to them and just ask them, well, what is that you're drawing, and why, and why is that? But even before we get to that, you mentioned could be video games, could be movies.
Right.
I think that also needs to be a part of the conversation with children and young people is, this concept, we need to talk about what really happens, because this concept of, guns being glamorous and shoot 'em up movies and all of that is one thing, but it doesn't reflect the reality, right? This is what really happens in those situations. It's you as parents, you're fighting a big tsunami of BS, but as parents, you can certainly talk to them about what they see in the media and alert them to the fact that that is it's not real. It's not real. And what it does is it makes us think that we know, what it is to be shot or to shoot someone, and it all becomes this no big deal or glamorized. And I think parents need to talk to their children and help them to understand that entertainment is one thing, real life is another.
Can we talk in these last few minutes, let's talk a little bit about some practical advice, and we've already tried to address this, and this isn't just about children, but this is about adults even, that in the wake of yesterday, I know some people want to just turn off the TV and and the like. So how do you balance just wanting to run away from this and staying informed?
Well, I wouldn't recommend running away. What I would recommend is sensible self-care. And I would also point to the fact that we're in times right now when it's not just things like mass shootings and gun deaths. There's so much going on that is stressful for a lot of people. You're in DC. There's some stressors right there. So it's natural for us to not want to deal with that 24/7, right? So, but what I would recommend is not completely trying to disconnect, shut your eyes to it, but to engage in mental health practices and self-care, right? So certainly don't watch the news on that 24-hour-a-day news cycle, unless it's to listen to your show, of course, Harold, in which case get that on repeat.
I appreciate that, yes.
Well, you offer something positive too, right? You're not just putting out sensational headlines. So to step away from that, because that's the other thing, talking about movies not being real, half the time the news isn't real. And I don't mean because it's fake. I mean, because it's just the headlines. It's, what bleeds leads and all of that. So instead, to limit your watching, but be informed, I would recommend, again, taking actual action if this bothers you. If your head is buried in the sand, you're not going to take any action. But get away from the news, the TV. My favorite, go out in the woods, or if you're not near woods, go somewhere for a walk, do your exercise, try to make sure that you're taking in positive things as well. Spend time with your family, whoever feeds you, basically. And I don't mean food. Whoever feeds your soul, spend quality time with them. Because one thing I know that is put in our faces when things like this happen is we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. Right? So how do you want to be living your life today? Do you want to be worrying? Do you want to be avoiding? Or do you want to be engaging in self-care and doing something positive for your community and the world?
And maybe also, because this incident happened in a place of worship, in a place of faith, for those who are inclined, it may be time to revisit some of your faith beliefs and work to strengthen them.
Absolutely. And the kind of faith that I'm thinking of, and maybe you're thinking of too, is not the blind faith that says, oh, I'll be protected, but strengthening your relationship with your higher power, whereby you understand that they're in charge, you're not, and that whatever happens, you can learn to deal with it, but not that, oh, well, God doesn't love me if something bad happens to me.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So yes, but strengthen your faith, and I would say your trust in your higher power. Not that he or she is going to give you exactly what you want, but that they are giving you what it is you need for your soul's development. That's my belief. And to complete your mission here on earth.
Yeah, I'm sure that is a conversation that started last night with some of the vigils that they had in Minneapolis. We began to see a bit of that, and I think that we are going to continue to see that over the course of not just this weekend, but even beyond. Obviously, that community has a lot of work to do regarding healing, and this incident will give us, time to reflect on our own situations and try to make sure that our communities are safe.
And it starts with us, right? Our communities are made up of us and other people. So again, how much are we putting out love versus hate? How much are we putting out peace versus violence? Is a place to start. By the way, the campaign is called the number one, and it's talking
The number
about
one
being the number one cause of death for children in the United States.
Yeah. I think there's something all of us can do. I think this is a great way to end this conversation. Dr. Nicole Cutts, always, always, always a pleasure to have you on the program. I appreciate your time.
Thanks, Harold.
Sure thing. That is the Daily Drum for this Thursday, August 28th. I'm Harold Fisher. Good night.